He walked out of that building with nothing. No badge, no job, no explanation. Just the sound of hundreds of people watching him go. One decision from a woman who never asked a single question. One moment that was supposed to end everything. But standing on that sidewalk, Nathan Cole had no idea that 7 black SUVs were already cutting through downtown traffic, heading straight for him. The woman who just destroyed his life? She was about to find out exactly how wrong she had been. This is the story of a man who lost it all. And what happened next? If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications because we drop stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. And while you're watching, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button too. It helps more than you know. Let's get into it. The morning had started the way most of Nathan Cole's mornings started badly, and then slightly less badly. He'd woken up at 5:15 because Emma had a nightmare and climbed into his bed sometime around 2 in the morning, and by the time he fell back asleep, she had somehow rotated 90 degrees, and her feet were pressed directly into his spine. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe. He'd intervened, thinking about the security rotation schedule he needed to finalize before the 8 o'clock briefing. At some point, he gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee with the cheap grounds because he'd forgotten to buy the good ones again. Emma woke up at 7, ate half a waffle, lost her left shoe, found it under the couch. Yes, he'd intervened and announced that her best friend Lily had told her that butterflies could taste with their feet, which she considered the most important piece of information she had ever received. Nathan told her that was actually true. She looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for him when he surprised her. "How do you know that?" "I know things," he said. She climbed into the back seat of his car, still holding the other half of her waffle, and he dropped her at school at 7:45, watched her run through the front doors without looking back, and then sat in the parking lot for a moment longer than necessary before pulling back into traffic. He was 32 years old. He had been doing this, the drop-offs, the cheap coffee, the late nights reviewing access logs for 6 years, since Emma was 2. Since her father decided that the life she had imagined for herself didn't include a baby and a man who worked security shifts and couldn't promise her anything exciting. Nathan didn't blame her anymore. He had for a long time. He didn't anymore. He got to Meridian Technologies by 8:05, which meant he was 5 minutes late, which meant Delia at the front desk gave him the look she always gave him when he was late, which was the look of someone who kept track of these things. "Morning, Delia, Mr. Cole." She handed him his visitor logs without looking up. "Miss Sinclair's already in." "She's always already in." Delia didn't answer that, because it wasn't the kind of thing you answered out loud at Meridian Technologies. Nathan had worked at Meridian for 6 years, which was longer than most people lasted in the security division. Turnover was high, partly because the hours were brutal and the pay was only decent, but mostly because working security at a company like Meridian meant spending a lot of time knowing things you weren't supposed to talk about, watching people do things that made you uncomfortable, and learning very quickly that the people at the top of the building did not particularly enjoy being questioned. He was good at his job, not in the way people said someone was good at their job when they wanted to be polite, actually good, in the way that showed up in the numbers, and the incident reports and the fact that in 6 years, a single breach had occurred on a shift he had personally supervised. He had built the access protocol that the company still used. He had redesigned the server room security architecture after flagging weaknesses in the previous system. He had 3 months ago submitted a detailed report to management about unusual access patterns in the executive suite patterns that suggested someone was entering restricted areas at hours that didn't line up with any scheduled activity. That report had gone nowhere. It had been read because he'd gotten a brief email from Marcus Webb, the chief operating officer, that said, "Thanks for your diligence. We'll look into it." And then nothing. And then more unusual access patterns that Nathan logged and flagged and watched disappear into the silence of the executive floor like everything else he ever sent up there. He wasn't the type to push. That was probably a flaw. He'd been told it was a flaw by his supervisor 2 years ago during an annual review. You have excellent instincts, but you need to advocate for yourself more aggressively. Nathan had written that down and then mostly ignored it, because advocating for himself aggressively felt like the kind of thing that got you fired at a place like Meridian, and he couldn't afford to get fired. Emma needed shoes. She needed school supplies. She needed the Saturday morning swim lessons that cost $60 a month, which Nathan had almost canceled twice before deciding that the look on her face when she got in the waters was worth $60. So he kept his head down. He did his job. He logged the things he was supposed to log. He sent the reports he was supposed to send. And he told himself that was enough. Tuesday morning in March, that Tuesday morning reason to think it was going to be a different kind of day. Call came at 11:17. He was in the middle of reviewing badge access records for the previous weekend when his phone rang internal line, executive floor, which meant either Webb's assistant or Sinclair's, and neither of those calls was ever good news. It was Sinclair's. Miss Sinclair would like to see you immediately, the assistant said. Her voice had that careful flatness that Nathan had learned to read as a bad sign. I'll be right up, he said. He straightened his badge, closed his laptop, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Avery Sinclair's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city and interior glass walls that let her see the open workspace below. It was the kind of office designed to make a point. Nathan had been in it maybe 4 times in 6 years, always briefly, always for something operational. He had never had a direct conversation with Sinclair that lasted more than 3 minutes. She was standing when he walked in, not seated, which he registered immediately. Webb was there too, standing near the window with his arms crossed in a way that suggested he had already decided something. There were 2 other people. Nathan didn't recognize a woman in a gray blazer, who was holding a tablet, and a man in a dark who hadn't looked up from whatever he was reading. The door closed behind Nathan. He said, Miss Sinclair, you wanted to see me? Avery Sinclair was 30 years old, which Nathan had always found slightly disorienting, given that she ran a company with 1,100 employees and a market cap that analysts regularly described as aggressive. She had the kind of focus that some people mistook for coldness the way she looked at you, like she was calculating the exact cost of every second she spent in your presence. Nathan had never had a strong feeling about her, one way or another. She was the CEO. She lived on the 14th floor. His job was to make sure the building was secure, and hers was to run the company, and those 2 things rarely intersected. They were intersecting now. Sit down, Mr. Cole, she said. He sat, she didn't. She walked to her desk but stayed standing behind it, and Nathan noticed that she had a folder open in front of her, and that she had glanced at it twice since he walked in. I'm going to be direct with you, she said. Please, he said. A confidential acquisition file went missing from our secure server at 11:42 last Friday night. It contained the full documentation for a pending deal that has not been publicly disclosed. The exposure of that file could cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars and compromise an acquisition we've been working on for 18 months. Nathan kept his face still. I understand the severity of that. I hope you do, she said, because security footage places you in the restricted executive server corridor at 11:38 Friday night, 4 minutes before the file was accessed without authorization. Was a silence. Nathan looked at her. Then he looked at Webb. Webb was studying the carpet. I wasn't in that corridor Friday night, Nathan said. The footage, I was at my daughter's school event Friday night. It was her class presentation. I signed in at 6:15. I signed out at 9:50. After that, I went home. I can give you names. I can give you timestamps. I can give you the photographs my daughter's teacher took that she sent to the parent group. I'm in 3 of them. Avery's jaw was tight. The footage is clear. Then the footage is wrong. He said it simply, not angrily, because he was genuinely more confused than angry at that moment. The idea that the footage showed him somewhere he hadn't been didn't compute. He was trying to figure out how that was possible while simultaneously trying to stay calm in a room where something was very clearly already decided. Mr. Cole Avery folded her hands on the folder. I have spent 18 months building this acquisition. I have made commitments to partners, to investors, To people whose trust I cannot afford to break. And I have a file missing. And I have a face on a camera. And that face is yours. I understand what you're saying. I'm telling you it's not accurate. I'm not asking you to agree with me, she said. I'm telling you what we found. Finally spoke. Nathan, it would be better if... I'd like to see the footage, Nathan said. The room went quiet. Avery looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the woman with the tablet. Something passed between them, not a word. Just a look, and the woman gave a small shake of her head. Won't be possible at this time, Avery said. Nathan looked at her. You're not going to show me the footage you're using to accuse me. This is not a courtroom, Mr. Cole. This is a private company, and I am the CEO of that company. And I have both the footage and the authority to make personnel decisions based on what that footage shows. He sat with that for a second. He was aware of how his hands were resting on his knees. He was aware that he was not raising his voice, which cost him something he couldn't quite name. I've worked here for 6 years, he said. In 6 years, there has not been a single security breach on my watch. 3 months ago, I flagged an access irregularity that no one followed up on. I submitted that report in writing. I have the date and the response email. Whatever is on that footage, your badge, please, Avery said. He stopped. She extended her hand. I'm asking you to surrender your access badge and your security credentials, effective immediately. HR will contact you regarding the formal separation process. You should not attempt to access any company systems or premises after today. Nathan looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He looked at Webb, who had found something very interesting on the far wall. He reached up and unclipped his badge from his lanyard. He set it on her desk without speaking. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out. The elevator ride down 14 floors took approximately 30 seconds. Nathan spent those 30 seconds looking at the door and not thinking about anything in particular, which was a skill he had developed over years of managing situations that felt out of his control. You didn't spiral in front of other people. You didn't let the noise in your head become noise in the room. You held it together until you were somewhere you didn't have to. The lobby of Meridian Technologies was a large open atrium with a marble floor and a reception desk, and usually somewhere between 30 and 60 people moving through it at any given time during the workday. Employees, visitors, delivery personnel, the occasional journalist trying to get a quote from someone who wasn't going to give them one. It was designed to project success. Every surface was clean. Every angle was deliberate. Nathan stepped off the elevator into the middle of all of that and started walking toward the front doors. He didn't make it fast. He didn't look at the floor. He walked the way he always walked, with his hands at his sides and his shoulders level. And he told himself that no one was watching, that people in lobbies don't pay attention to the people walking through them. This was just another moment in the middle of a Tuesday, and no one would remember it. But he could feel it, the weight of people's awareness. The way sound seemed to change around him, conversations dropping a register, heads turning in that careful, not quite looking way. Always had good instincts for when a room had shifted. It was part of what made him good at his job. And this room had shifted. Someone near the elevators said his name in a low voice. He didn't look. He kept walking. His lanyard hung empty around his neck, the little clip where his head had been for 6 years now, holding nothing. He considered taking it off and then decided against it, because stopping to deal with a lanyard in the middle of this lobby felt like the one thing that might actually crack something in him that he wasn't ready to let crack. He pushed through the glass front doors and stepped outside. The air hit him cold and clean. March in the city. A gust of wind off the avenue. He stood on the front steps of the building and let out a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the elevator. And for a moment, he just stood there with his hands in his pockets and thought about Emma, what he was going to tell her, about the swim lessons that cost $60, about the 8 years of her life that had required him to stay employed, stay steady, stay available, and how much of that had been held together by this job that he no longer had. He was still standing there when he noticed the traffic. There were 7 of them, black SUVs, the kind with tinted windows that blotted out the interior entirely, moving in a close formation that didn't belong in normal downtown traffic. Intervened. They weren't driving aggressively, no sirens, No lights, but there was something coordinated about the way they moved that made Nathan watch them. Spent enough years around corporate security and law enforcement to recognize organized vehicle movement when he saw it. They pulled up to the front of the Meridian building. All 7, in sequence, stopping along the curb like they had rehearsed it. Which Nathan thought they probably had. The doors opened, and women in dark suits, several in what looked like federal identification lanyards, 2 carrying document cases. At least one he clocked immediately, as legal she had that particular posture. A few in business attire that didn't quite match either federal or legal, which he mentally categorized as financial. And then from the middle vehicle, a man in his early 60s, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing an overcoat that had clearly been expensive 20 years ago and was now just well-worn and comfortable. He moved slowly but deliberately, the kind of slow that came from confidence rather than age. He looked directly at Nathan, not at the building, at the entrance. At Nathan specifically, like he had a photograph and had just confirmed the match. He walked over. Nathan didn't move. The older man stopped 2 feet away and looked at him steadily. His eyes were light gray, and they held an expression that Nathan couldn't immediately read, something between relief and assessment. "Cole," he said. "It wasn't a question," Nathan said. "My name is Gerald Marsh. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Task Force." He reached into his coat, produced a credentials case, and held it open. "We've been looking for you." Nathan looked at the credentials. They were real, he knew, what real federal identification looked like. And more importantly, he knew the particular way a person held it who was used to showing it rather than performing it. "Looking for me," Nathan repeated. "We need to speak with you," Marsh said. "And I think you may need to speak with us." Behind Marsh, the rest of the team was moving toward the building's entrance. A woman in the gray blazer, different from the one upstairs. This one had a federal lanyard, was already on her phone. 2 others were carrying cases that Nathan recognized as the kind used for digital evidence equipment. He looked back at Marsh. "I just got fired," Nathan said. Marsh nodded like this didn't surprise him. "I know," he said. Nathan stared at him. "How did you hear?" "That was 20 minutes ago." "Mr. Cole," Marsh said, "we've had eyes on this building for 11 days. Quite a bit about what's been happening inside it." He paused. "We also know what's been happening to you. And we think you deserve to understand why." The wind picked up off the avenue and moved through the space between them. Nathan looked at the 7 SUVs. He looked at the stream of federal personnel moving through the doors he'd just walked out of. He looked at the empty clip on his lanyard. He thought about Emma at school, drawing pictures and trading facts about butterflies with her friends, completely unaware that her father was standing on a sidewalk in downtown trying to figure out if the worst day of his life had just gotten stranger or better. He looked at Marsh. "All right," Nathan said, "talk." They sat in the back of Marsh's vehicle, which was where federal investigators apparently had every important conversation, in Nathan's experience. The seats were clean but worn. Someone had left a coffee cup in the holder that hadn't been there long. Outside the tinted windows, Nathan could see the lobby of Meridian through the glass facade, the distant shapes of personnel moving through the atrium. 8 years ago, Marsh said, you were working corporate security for a financial services firm called Caldwell Orion. You were 24. 23 when I started there, Nathan said. 24 when things got complicated. Marsh almost smiled. You submitted an internal irregularity report about trading activity in the derivatives desk. You were told it was above your clearance. You submitted a second report through an external channel. Nathan didn't say anything, because that was all accurate, and he wasn't sure where it was going. That second report landed on the desk of a junior analyst in our office, who knew enough to escalate it, Marsh said. What followed was a 14-month investigation that resulted in 11 arrests and the recovery of approximately $230 million in fraudulent proceeds. 3,400 employees kept their jobs. A pension fund serving retired municipal workers did not collapse. Nathan looked at him. I know what happened. I was there. You also disappeared from the investigation's visible record, Marsh said. By request, yours and your attorneys. You were 24 with a baby, and you didn't want to be the guy whose name was on the testimony. We honored that. He folded his hands on his knee. The records from that case, your original, reports, the documentation chain, the communications, those records have become material evidence in a current investigation. Into what? Into Meridian Technologies, Marsh said. Specifically into the theft and sale of proprietary acquisition data to competing parties over a period of approximately 16 months. Nathan was quiet for a moment. 16 months, give or take. I flagged access irregularities 3 months ago, Nathan said. I sent a written report, we know, Marsh said. We have a copy of it. How? Because we've been monitoring communications in and out of Meridian's executive structure for the better part of a year, Marsh said. He said it plainly, without drama, the way someone states a thing that simply is. Mr. Cole, I need to tell you something about what happened this morning, because I think you need to hear it from someone other than the people who just put you on the street. Nathan waited. The security footage that was used as the basis for your termination, Marsh said, was altered. We have the original. We have the original and the modified version, and we have the technical record of when and how the modification was made, and we have a very clear chain of evidence showing who made it. Nathan heard that. He heard each word, individually, the way you hear things when your nervous system is deciding whether to register them as real. The footage was altered, he said. Yes. Someone edited the video to put me in that corridor, to make Sinclair think I was responsible for the file going missing. Yes, Marsh said. Mr. Cole, you weren't fired because you did something wrong. You were fired because someone needed you gone before we got here. You were asking the right questions. It's right questions. You were creating a documentation trail, and you were becoming a problem for the person inside the building who has been selling your company's most sensitive information for a year and a half. Nathan looked out the window at the lobby, at the clean marble, the glass facade that reflected the gray March sky back at itself. He said. Marsh reached into the document case at his feet, produced a single photograph. He held it out. Nathan looked at it. He recognized the face immediately. He'd sat in briefings with that face in the hallway of the 14th floor, and exchanged the nod that colleagues exchange. He'd submitted, now that he thought about it, his access irregularity report directly to that face's inbox. He sat with the photograph for a moment. Then he handed it back. Call my daughter's school, he said. She gets out at 3:15, and I need someone to pick her up if I'm going to be here past 2. Marsh looked at him for a beat. Then he reached into his coat and extended his phone. Use mine, he said. It's secure. Nathan took the phone. He dialed the school's front office from memory, because he had called that number enough times that it lived in his hands now. The way important things did. He told the front desk he might be late, that his neighbor Mrs. Okafor had a key and knew Emma, that if he wasn't there by 3:30 they should call her first. He hung up and gave Marsh back the phone. Outside, through the tinted glass, 2 members of Marsh's team were being met at the Meridian lobby entrance by what looked like the company's legal counsel. He could tell by the posture, the speed, particular expression of someone who has just received news they were hoping not to receive today. Okay, Nathan said. Tell me everything. And Gerald Marsh, who had been investigating financial crimes for 31 years, and who had seen people respond to this kind of moment in every way imaginable, looked at the man sitting next to him, 32 years old, empty lanyard clip, borrowed phone call already made for his daughter, and began to talk. Inside the building, on the 14th floor, Avery Sinclair stood at her window and watched at the federal vehicles below and felt the specific, cold sensation of something being wrong in a way she didn't yet fully understand. She had made a decision this morning based on what she'd seen and what she'd been told, and the pressure of 18 months of work potentially unraveling. She had acted quickly. She had acted decisively. She watched a man in an overcoat talking to Nathan Cole in the back of an SUV, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the possibility that quick and decisive had not meant right. She pulled out her phone. Webb didn't answer. She tried again. Voicemail. She stood at the window a little longer, watching the vehicles, watching the people moving in and out of her building's entrance with credentials she couldn't read from 14 floors up. She thought about the folder on her desk and the footage she'd been shown and the face of the man she'd asked to hand over his badge. He'd intervened. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she told him she wasn't going to show him the footage. She had read it in that moment as guilt, the particular stillness of someone caught. Watching the street below, she was less certain what she had read. Assistant summoned. Her assistant knocked and opened the door without waiting, which only happened when something was happening. "Sinclair," she said. "Federal investigators are requesting access to the executive floor." Avery turned from the window. "Tell them," she said, to come up. And somewhere in the back of a black SUV on the street below, Nathan Cole was learning the shape of the thing that had been built around him, piece by careful piece, by someone he had trusted with his reports and his concerns and his professional instincts for 3 months, and he was listening without interrupting, because he was the kind of man who understood that the most important thing you could do sometimes was simply make yourself stay still and hear the truth all the way to the end. Marsh talked for 40 minutes straight, and Nathan listened to all of it. The way you listen, not the way you listen when you're waiting for your turn to speak. The real kind of listening, where you're tracking every detail and filing it and cross-referencing it against things you already know. And sometimes a piece lands in a way that makes something else suddenly make sense. Like a lock you've been looking at, finally showing you where the keyhole actually is. The Financial Crimes Task Force had been watching Meridian Technologies for 11 months. It had started, Marsh explained, with an anomaly flagged by a competitor's legal team during a failed acquisition bid. They had lost a deal they shouldn't have lost. And when their analysts went back through the numbers, yes, he'd intervened. Evidence that proprietary information about their own negotiating position had reached the other side of the table before it should have been possible. That thread had been pulled carefully over months until it led back to Meridian. Specifically, it led back to the pattern of data, leaving Meridian's systems at irregular hours, moving through proxy channels, landing in the hands of at least 3 separate competing entities who had used it to undercut deals, redirect investments, position themselves favorably in markets that Meridian had spent years cultivating. 16 months of this, maybe longer. The 11 months of active investigation had confirmed 16, but Marsh said quietly that he suspected the actual timeline was closer to 2 years, and that the earlier activity had been careful enough that it didn't leave the kind of traces that triggered automated alerts. Whoever was running this inside your building, Marsh said, understood security systems well enough to work culture around most of them. All of them. But most. They didn't understand mine, Nathan said. Marsh said. They didn't. And that became a problem for them when you started submitting reports. Nathan thought about the email from Webb. "Thanks for your diligence. We'll look into it." He thought about sending that report and getting that response and telling himself that was probably caution, that maybe he was being overly, that maybe the access patterns had a legitimate explanation he wasn't aware of. "How much of what I flagged matched what you had?" he asked. "That when we pulled your report from the internal communications we'd been monitoring, 3 of our analysts flagged it independently as significant," Marsh said. "You were looking at the same anomalies we were looking at. You just didn't have the full picture." "Nobody gave me the full picture," Marsh said. "They didn't." There was a pause. Outside, another vehicle had arrived, a dark sedan. Government plates. 2 people getting out, with the particular purposeful energy of people who had somewhere specific to be and knew exactly how to get there. "The footage," Nathan said. "Walk me through what you have." Marsh reached into the document case again, and this time produced a tablet. Pulled up a side-by-side comparison, 2 versions of what appeared to be the same security camera feed from the executive corridor on the 14th floor. Same timestamp, same angle, same empty hallway until it wasn't empty. Modified version. A figure in a dark jacket entered the frame at 11:38 to the server access panel and spent approximately 4 minutes at the terminal before leaving. No. The figure's face was partially obscured by the camera angle, but the build was consistent with Nathan's, and more importantly, the badge ID logged at that access point matched his credentials. In the original version, the hallway was empty for that entire window. Empty, and then at 11:51, more than 13 minutes after the modified version, showed Nathan's alleged entry a different figure, different build, moving faster. Wearing, Nathan noticed the same dark jacket that had been composited onto the fabricated version of him. That's the original, Marsh said, pointing to the right side of the screen. The figure at 11:51 is who actually accessed that terminal. The modification took the original footage of this person, extracted the clothing and general body shape, and composited elements of it onto a fabricated scene using your credential data to timestamp it. He paused. Sophisticated work, not the kind of thing you do with consumer software. They had access to the security system, Nathan said. Obviously, which means whoever did this has administrative-level credentials for our internal camera network. Yes, Nathan stared at the tablet screen, at the empty hallway that was supposed to contain him, and the face at 11:51. You can't make it out. Not from this angle, no, but we have other cameras. Marsh swiped to the next image. This is from a lobby-level elevator bank camera. Same night, 11:44, which puts this person coming down from the executive floor approximately 7 minutes after the server access. He handed Nathan the tablet. Nathan looked at the photograph on the screen for a long moment. The resolution was better than the corridor footage. Lobby cameras tended to be higher spec because they covered public-facing areas. The figure was facing mostly away from the camera. They'd been caught turning mid-step in the particular careless way of someone who believes they aren't being watched because they have taken steps to make sure they aren't being watched. And in that three-quarter angle, the face was visible enough. Nathan had seen that face that morning. He had nodded at it in the hallway of the 14th floor on his way to Avery Sinclair's office. He handed the tablet back to Marsh and looked out the window. Derek Holt, he said. Marsh didn't confirm or deny it immediately, which was its own kind of answer. What do you know about him? He's Executive Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. Been at the company longer than I have, I think close to 9 years. He runs the team that manages external acquisition relationships, which means he has visibility into every major deal the company works on before it goes public. Nathan paused. He also has legacy administrative access to most of our internal systems because he was part of the team that built out the digital infrastructure 7 years ago. They never fully revoked his credentials when his role changed. Marsh was writing something in a small notebook. Did you know that about his legacy access before today? I knew it in the abstract. It was in the system documentation. But it wasn't something I was actively monitoring because his credentials had always been clean. Irregular logins, no anomalous access events until about 5 months ago. You flagged something 5 months ago? I flagged a pattern, a specific person. The access pattern I documented in my report was attributed to credential ID strings, not names, because that's how the log system works. I didn't connect it to Holt specifically because the credential IDs in question were registered to an administrative pool, not to an individual. He stopped, which means either he found a way to route his access through shared credentials, or someone helped him set that up, Marsh said. Yes, we think it's the latter. Nathan absorbed that. There's more than one person involved. We believe so. We don't have a complete picture yet, which is part of why this conversation is important. Nathan sat back against the seat. He thought about Derek Holt. He thought about the 9 times he had been in the same room as this man over the past 6 years, and the complete and total absence of any instinct that something was wrong. He thought about what that meant about his own instincts, and then he pushed that thought aside because spiraling about it wasn't useful. The acquisition file that went missing, Nathan said. That's what Sinclair confronted me about this morning. The Orion Lake deal. Marsh looked at him. How do you know what the deal is called? I don't know what it's called. I know it exists because I've seen the physical security protocols around the documentation, the restricted file designations, the access control modifications that were requested and implemented over the past 3 months. I didn't know the name. I just knew something big was in motion. He looked at Marsh. Is that what Holt accessed Friday night? The Orion Lake documentation? The complete acquisition file. Term sheets, valuation models, the counterparty negotiating position, projected post-acquisition restructuring plan. Marsh said it the way you say things that you've spent months thinking about. If that lands in the wrong hands before the deal closes, the counterparty loses all negotiating leverage. Meridian's acquisition strategy is exposed to every competitor in the space, and the deal likely collapses entirely. We're talking about a loss that would affect the company's market position for years. And Holt sold it. We believe he sold it Friday night, yes. Or at least transmitted the file to a third party who has already paid for it. Marsh paused. Which is why the timing of your termination this morning is significant. He needed you removed before we arrived. You were the only person in that building who had been consistently documenting what he was doing, even without knowing it was him specifically. With you gone and your access revoked, your documentation trail becomes contested, a fired employee with a potential motive to fabricate. Nathan thought about the empty clip on his lanyard, about how clean and efficient the whole thing had been. Badge surrendered, building access revoked, HR notified. Someone had planned that. Not Avery Sinclair. She had been handed a piece of evidence and reacted to it, quickly and decisively, and without asking the questions she should have asked. But that wasn't the same as planning. Plan had come from somewhere else. He gave her the footage, Nathan said. We believe so. He handed her a fabricated recording, pointed at me, and let her pull the trigger. You walked out of the building at 10:47, Marsh said. We were 2 blocks away. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, You were close. We were close, Marsh agreed. And we're here now. They went inside at 12:22. Nathan walked back through the front doors, Technologies, 43 minutes after he'd walked out of them. And this time he was not alone. Yet he'd evince, and this time people in the lobby stopped what they were doing and watched without trying to hide it. Marsh walked beside him. 2 other investigators flanked slightly behind. Yes, he'd intervened. The rest of the team was already distributed through the building. Nathan had learned during the last 10 minutes in the vehicle that several of them had entered through the parking structure and the service entrance, and that Meridian's legal counsel had been notified of the investigation's scope and had stopped pushing back approximately 6 minutes ago. Delia at the front desk looked at Nathan with an expression he had never seen on her face before, which was something close to uncertainty. He gave her a brief nod that he hoped communicated nothing in particular and kept walking. The elevator to the 14th floor was quiet. Marsh stood beside him and studied the directory panel and didn't speak. One of the other investigators, a younger woman named Reyes, who had barely said 10 words, but who Nathan has observed tracking every person in every room they'd passed through, with the focused attention of someone very good at her job, stood at the back of the elevator and checked something on her phone. Nathan looked at his reflection in the elevator doors. He looked tired. He also looked like himself, which was something. The doors opened on 14. Avery Sinclair was standing in the corridor outside her office. She had clearly been waiting, because she had the particular stillness of someone who has been working hard to project calm, while not feeling especially calm. Her assistant was nearby, hovering at a careful distance. Further down the corridor, Nathan could see 2 members of Marsh's team already positioned outside the door to Derek Holt's office. Avery looked at Nathan, then at Marsh, then back at Nathan. Mr. Cole, she said. Her voice was careful and controlled, but something behind her eyes was moving fast. Miss Sinclair, he said. Marsh stepped forward and introduced himself with credentials. He explained, in the measured and precise language of someone who had done this many times, that the task force was executing a court-authorized investigation into financial crimes involving the misappropriation and sale of proprietary information within Meridian Technologies. He explained that they required access to the executive floor, to specific systems, and to certain personnel. He explained that Meridian's legal counsel had already been informed and had indicated cooperation. Avery listened to all of it without interrupting, which Nathan noticed. She was the kind of person who didn't interrupt, not because she was deferential, but because she understood that interrupting someone who held more information than you did was a way of losing ground. When Marsh finished, she said, What do you need from me specifically? Your full cooperation and access, Marsh said, and a conversation at your earliest convenience about the basis for the personnel action taken earlier today. Avery's eyes moved to Nathan again, kept his face neutral, because he had decided in the elevator that he was not going to perform anything for her, not vindication, grievance, the satisfaction of watching her expression change when she understood how wrong she had been. He wasn't there for that. Of course, she said. Down the corridor, the door to Derek Holt's office opened. One of Marsh's investigators said something into a radio and stepped back in. Nathan watched the door close. Is Holt in his office? Nathan asked Marsh quietly. He was 40 minutes ago, Marsh said. We've had eyes on the building. Hasn't left. Avery heard that exchange and turned to look at the corridor. Something shifted in her face, a realization working its way through, piece by piece. Nathan watched her get there. It took about 4 seconds, and during those 4 seconds, her expression did 3 different things before it settled into something flat and stunned. Derek, she said. Not a question. Not really even a statement. Just the name, sitting alone. Marsh looked at her steadily. We'll need that conversation sooner rather than later. Miss Sinclair. They used the large conference room on 14 because it had enough space and enough screens to lay out what needed to be laid out. Marsh's team set up efficiently and without unnecessary movement. The document cases opened, laptops connected, the side-by-side footage comparison pulled up on the room's main display. A financial analyst named Park, who looked about 28 and had the specific exhausted energy of someone who had been doing 17-hour days for several months, began walking through the data chain on a second screen. Avery sat at the head of the conference table. Her general counsel, a compact woman named Harriet Lowe, who had arrived from her own office 2 floors down with the slightly breathless quality of someone who had been running mentally since the first phone call, sat beside her. 2 of Meridian's own IT security staff were present, summoned from their floor, and now looking at Park's screen with expressions that ranged from professional interest to barely concealed alarm. Nathan sat midway down the table, not at the head, not at the foot. Midway, which felt accurate. Park walked them through the data trail first. The access patterns, the credential routing, the transmission logs showing files moving out of Meridian's system through a layered proxy chain that had been constructed carefully, but not, ultimately, carefully enough. Explained the timestamps. He cross-referenced the access events with Derek Holt's schedule, with his building entry logs, with the physical location data from his company-issued phone. Harriet Lowe asked 3 sharp questions that revealed she was tracking every word. Avery asked none, which Nathan thought said something about the state she was in. Marsh pulled up the footage, the original version first. The empty corridor, the real figure at 11:51, the modified version. Avery watched the screen for the entire duration of both clips without speaking. When they finished, she looked at her hands on the table. No. I showed that footage this morning, she said. To a member of my own staff, Marsh said. The modified version. Yes, and it was placed in your security monitoring systems archive, Wednesday night, Marsh said. Backdated to appear as original Friday night footage. Whoever did this had administrative access to your archiving system, sufficient technical knowledge to make the modification undetectable through standard review. Harriet Lowe said quietly, what level of access would that require? One of Meridian's IT staff answered before anyone else could. His name was Gabe, and he was the kind of quiet, competent person who existed in IT departments everywhere and was never thanked enough for anything. He said, executive-level administrative override. We have 6 people in the building with that level of access to the archive system. He paused. Mr. Holt is one of them. Avery looked up. Nathan watched her. He had been watching her, intermittently, for the past 20 minutes, not to catalog her reactions, to measure how bad she felt, because he was genuinely trying to understand the mourning that had just happened. He wanted to understand the chain of events that had put him on a sidewalk with an empty lanyard clip. And part of that chain was the person sitting at the head of this table who had looked at a piece of evidence and acted on it instantly and absolutely. She had been wrong. She had acted without asking him to explain, without giving him access to the thing being used against him, without taking 20 minutes to consider the possibility that a man with 6 years of clean record and a stack of documented concerns about exactly this kind of irregularity might not be the most obvious villain in the room. She had been wrong, and she had done it in front of hundreds of people. Wasn't going to say that. Not now. Maybe not ever. depending on how the next several hours unfolded. But he was keeping the full shape of it in mind, because he thought he was owed at least the internal honesty of acknowledging what had happened to him. Reyes came in through the conference room door and leaned down to say something quietly to Marsh. Marsh nodded and stood. "We need to move to Mr. Holt's office," he said. He looked around the room. "Miss Sinclair, I'm going to ask you to stay here with Agent Park for the moment." "Mr. Cole," he paused. There was something in the pause that Nathan recognized as a kind of courtesy, an acknowledgement of the unusual position Nathan occupied in this room. "You're welcome to come, or you can stay." Nathan pushed back his chair. "I'll come." Derek Holt's office was half the size of Avery's, but furnished with the specific deliberate taste of someone who had thought carefully about what their office said about them. Bookshelves with the right books, a credenza with the right family photographs in the right frames, desk that was organized in the particular way of someone who understood that organized desks communicated competence. Holt was behind the desk when they came in. He had clearly had some warning, not enough, but some that he had closed his laptop and straightened and arranged himself into the posture of someone who was surprised to see federal investigators, and not someone who had been thinking hard for the last 40 minutes about what he would say when they arrived. He was 51, silver at the temples, the kind of face that had always projected confidence and was projecting it now. The layer underneath was doing something else that Nathan could see, because he had spent 6 years learning to read the gaps between how people looked and what they were actually doing. "Mr. Holt," Marsh said. He produced his credentials and went through the formal introduction. Holt listened with the expression of someone experiencing a genuine misunderstanding that would be cleared up very shortly. "Gentlemen," Holt said. His eyes moved to Nathan. Something tightened around them briefly, controlled fast, but Nathan caught it. "I'm happy to cooperate with whatever you're looking into, but I have to say I'm not sure what this has to do with me." "That's fine," Marsh said. "We're going to explain it." What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. Marsh was not theatrical. He laid out what they had: the access logs, the transmission records, the original footage, the technical analysis of the archive modification, in the same measured and precise manner he'd used in the conference room. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean across the desk. He sat in the chair across from Holt and talked, and the two investigators flanking the door stood with the particular stillness of people who didn't need to do anything else. Nathan stood off to the side and watched Holt's face. He watched the confidence hold for the first 3 minutes. He watched it start to work harder in the next 2. He watched it break, not completely, dramatically, crack at the edges in the precise moments when Marsh cited the specific technical details of the archive modification, because those details were particular enough that they couldn't be generalized away, couldn't be attributed to someone else, or explained as coincidence, and Holt was smart enough to know that. "I'd like to speak with an attorney," Holt said. His voice was level. "Credit to him for that." "Of course," Marsh said. He stood. "We'll arrange that." He looked at Reyes, who nodded and moved forward with the formal next steps. In the transition of that moment, Derek Holt looked across the room at Nathan. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't defiance either. Something more complicated and less clean than either of those things. The look of a person who has been caught and knows it and is still processing what that means for the version of themselves they have spent years constructing. Nathan held the look for a moment. Then he looked away, because there was nothing in that exchange he needed. He walked out of the office and into the corridor. The 14th floor had gotten quieter in the last hour, in the specific way that floors get quiet when people understand that something significant is happening, and the appropriate response is to stay at their desks and not make noise. A few faces visible through glass walls. The low hum of a building trying to process something it didn't yet have language for. Nathan walked to the window at the end of the corridor. He looked out at the city. March sky, pale and high. Traffic 14 floors below. Somewhere across the grid of streets, his daughter was in a classroom learning something, or pretending to learn it, while actually thinking about butterflies. He was standing there. He's thinking anything in particular, just standing when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Avery Sinclair. He'd intervened. She had come from the conference room alone. She looked like someone who had just sat through an hour of information that had rearranged a significant number of things she'd believed to be true. She looked, Nathan thought, a little younger than she'd looked this morning, not in a good way. The way that happens when something strips a layer off. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him. She opened her mouth once and then closed it, which Nathan had never seen her do before. He waited. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. The words came out measured, but not rehearsed. He'd heard enough rehearsed apologies to know the difference. "I don't think an apology is going to be—" She stopped. "I handled this morning badly. I had a piece of evidence that I trusted because I wanted to trust it, because it was easier than the alternative, and I acted on it before I should have." Nathan looked at her. "You could have asked me to explain myself," he said. She said, "I didn't. You could have shown me the footage before you asked for my badge. You had 6 years of my record in this building. Incidents, multiple commendations, and a report I submitted 3 months ago that essentially documented the activity we're now all standing here dealing with," she said. The words were quiet and didn't try to cover anything. He looked out the window for a moment. The city below, doing what it always did, indifferent to the specific drama of this particular floor of this particular building. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 8. I've been doing this job for 6 years, because of her, because it's steady, because it's good enough, because it kept the lights on and the swim lessons paid for. And you put me on that sidewalk without a question." He paused. "I need you to know what that felt like, because I don't think you thought about that piece of it when you did it." Avery didn't say anything. She looked at him steadily and didn't try to fill the silence, which he respected more than he expected to. She said again, and then after a moment, "I'm going to make it right. Exactly what that looks like yet, but I'm going to make it right." Nathan looked at her. She meant it. He could tell she meant it, which didn't fix had happened, but was at least a real thing in a morning that had contained a number of unreliable things. Once. But, honestly, "I know you will," he said. And down the corridor, yet through the glass wall of the conference room, Park was still on his screens, and Reyes was on her radio, and the documentation of 16 months of quiet betrayal was being laid out with the kind of chintz and care that the person who had built it had perhaps not expected it would eventually receive. Nathan put his hands in his pockets and looked at the city and thought about nothing in particular, which was the only thing left to do. The afternoon moved the way afternoons do, when everything has already happened, and the world hasn't caught up yet, slowly, with a kind of suspended quality, like the building itself was holding its breath. Nathan spent most of it in a secondary conference room on the 12th floor that Marsh's team had commandeered for interviews. Yes, he'd intervened. The room was smaller than the one on 14, with a round table and chairs that didn't quite match, and a window that looked out onto the building's internal courtyard rather than the city. Someone had left a half-eaten sandwich on the credenza, but he moved it. By 3 o'clock it had been there long enough that it had become part of the room's geography. Yes, he'd intervened, and Nathan found himself glancing at it periodically, the way you notice something that shouldn't be there, but has been there long enough that removing it feels like more effort than leaving it. Reyes conducted his interview. She was methodical and patient, and asked the same questions in slightly different ways until she was satisfied that she had everything useful, which Nathan recognized as good technique and didn't resist. He told her everything he knew, the access patterns, the reports he'd submitted, the specific credential IDs he'd flagged, the timeline of management responses or lack thereof. He told her about the 3 occasions over the past 5 months when he'd considered escalating outside the company, and had talked himself out of it for reasons that, sitting here now, felt thin and insufficient. "Why didn't you?" Reyes asked. "Escalate external." He thought about that honestly. "Because I didn't have enough. I had patterns. I had anomalies. I had a documented feeling that something was wrong. But I didn't have a name or a specific event I could point to and say, definitively, this is the thing." He paused. "And because I'd already been told, essentially, that I was being overly cautious. When someone in authority tells you that, you start second-guessing your own read on a situation, even when your read is right." Reyes wrote something down. "Who told you that?" About 4 months ago. He didn't say it directly. He said it the way people say things when they don't want to say them directly. Something about how our systems had robust safeguards, and he was confident in the existing protocols. Nathan looked at the table. He said it in a way that made me feel like I was the problem for asking. Reyes looked up from her notebook. Marcus Webb. Yes. She wrote something else down, and Nathan watched her write it, and thought out the thing, Caesar. In the SUV, we believe there's more than one person involved, and felt something settle in his stomach that wasn't quite surprise. He said, he's part of it. Reyes didn't confirm or deny it. We're still developing a full picture, she said, which was the kind of answer that wasn't an answer. He's the one who received my reports, Nathan said. He's the one who sent the responses. If Holt was routing his access through shared credentials, he needed someone with the authority to keep those credentials active and unreviewed. Webb has that authority. He thought about it. Webb also had the authority to make sure my reports stayed on his desk and didn't go anywhere else. Reyes was quiet for a moment, her pen resting on the notebook page. Mr. Cole, she said, I want to be clear that nothing I say in this room constitutes confirmation of investigative conclusions that haven't been formally established. I understand, Nathan said. And I also want to be clear, she continued, that the scenario you're describing is consistent with the evidence we're currently reviewing. He nodded slowly. He looked at the sandwich on the credenza. Yes, he looked at the window overlooking the courtyard where 2 members of Marsh's team were talking quietly near a planter that hadn't been watered recently enough. He thought about Marcus Webb, about the 43 emails he had sent to Webb's address over the past 18 months, about the way Webb had always responded promptly, professionally, and with the specific warmth of someone who wanted you to feel heard without actually listening to anything you said. He thought about the COO's office on the 14th floor, 3 doors down from Holt's, and the way the 2 of them had always seemed comfortable around each other, in the particular way of people who share something, discuss in front of other people. He was in the room this morning, Nathan said. When Sinclair fired me, was there. We know, Reyes said, standing by the window, saying much. Nathan tried to reconstruct the room. 2 people he hadn't recognized: the woman with the tablet, the man in the dark suit who hadn't looked up, the man in the dark suit. In Sinclair's office this morning. Who was he? Reyes glanced at her notes. We're looking into several individuals who were present on the executive floor this morning. He wasn't one of yours, and he wasn't company staff. I've been in this building 6 years. I know the staff. Mr. Cole, I'm not asking you to confirm it, Nathan said. I'm telling you what I observed. The man in the dark suit in Sinclair's office this morning was not a federal investigator and was not a Meridian Technologies employee. He was there for a specific reason during a specific event, and I think you should know that I noticed him. Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something down. Thank you, she said. That's useful. Marsh came in around 4. He set 2 paper cups of coffee on the table, the building's cafeteria coffee, which Nathan knew from experience was mediocre in the specific way of coffee that had been in the craft of too long, and sat down across from Nathan without the formality of the earlier interview. How are you doing? He asked. I've had better Tuesdays, Nathan said. Marsh almost smiled at that. He wrapped his hands around his cup. We've been in Holt's systems for the past 3 hours. His personal workstation, his access records, his communication channels. He looked at his coffee, was careful. More careful than most people we deal with. But he'd been doing this long enough that careful stopped feeling like something he needed to maintain at the same level. Complacency, Nathan said. Something like that. There are gaps in the proxy chain. He was using small ones, but enough. Park has been on them since noon. Marshed some coffee. Made a face that suggested the same conclusions. Nathan had always reached about the cafeteria. The operation had 3 components. Holt identified the targets, the acquisition files, the strategic data, whatever had the highest market value to competitors. Webb managed the internal cover-keeping security reports contained, making sure the administrative credentials Holt was using stayed off the active review list, handling anyone who asked the wrong questions. And the 3rd component, Nathan said, transmission. Getting the data out of the system cleanly and into the hands of buyers without creating a traceable financial trail back to anyone in this building. Marsh paused. We believe that's where the man you noticed this morning comes in. We believe he's a broker, someone who operates between the sellers inside companies and the buyers want what they're selling. No. Nathan thought about the man in the dark suit, the way he hadn't looked up from whatever he was reading. The specific quality of stillness that, Nathan now understood, wasn't someone being politely unobtrusive during a difficult personnel meeting. It was someone making sure he was present to confirm that the loose end was being handled. He was there to watch me get fired, Nathan said. We think so, yes. To make sure it happened. Yes. Nathan sat with that for a moment. The idea that a person had been in the room for the specific purpose of watching him hand over his badge, not as a consequence, as an accident, as a planned event, step process, had a particular quality to it that was different from the general wrongness of everything else he'd learned today. It was personal in a way that the rest of it wasn't quite personal, even though all of it had happened to him. Do you have a name? He asked. We have a name we're working to verify, Marsh said. That's as far as I can go with you on that today. Right. Nathan looked at his coffee. Drank some. It was as bad as expected. Webb. What happens to Webb? That's going to depend on a number of things. What his cooperation looks like. What the full scope of his involvement turns out to be. Marsh looked at him. He hasn't been formally confronted yet. We're building the picture before we do that. When you do, he's going to try to minimize it. He'll say he was managing a subordinate's concerns, that he didn't know the full extent of what Holt was doing. He'll present himself as peripheral. They usually do. He's not peripheral, Nathan said. Without Webb, Holt can't have kept this running for 16 months. 2 of them are the architecture. Holt is the operation, and Webb is the structure that hides it. Marsh looked at him steadily. You've been thinking about this. I've had a few hours, Nathan said. Marsh nodded slowly. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at it for a moment. The way you look at a thing when you're deciding whether to say this thing. There's something else, he said. Nathan waited. The report you submitted 3 months ago. The one Webb acknowledged and buried. Marsh folded his hands on the table. We've been able to establish that within 48 hours of your report landing in Webb's inbox, Holt modified his access patterns. He slowed down, spaced out the activity, changed the transmission schedule. He paused. Because Webb told him. Nathan didn't say anything. Your report didn't go nowhere, Marsh said. It went directly to the person it was designed to protect. And that person used it to adjust the operation and avoid detection. He looked at Nathan. I wanted you to know that, because I think you've been sitting here wondering if your instincts were right. They were right. What happened to your report afterward? That's on them, not on you. Nathan looked at the window. The courtyard outside was emptying as the afternoon shifted, people heading home, the building beginning the slow process of becoming quieter. He thought about the 48 hours after he'd sent that report. He'd been at home with Emma, doing homework with her at the kitchen table, making the pasta she liked, with the sauce from the jar because he was tired and she didn't actually care as long as there was enough Parmesan. He'd been living his normal Tuesday evening life, while Derek Holt and Marcus Webb were sitting somewhere in this building, reading his words and using them to stay one step ahead of the truth he'd been trying to tell. It was a hard thing to sit with. Not because it surprised him entirely, but because the distance between I think something is wrong and I know exactly how wrong it is a distance that costs something to travel, and he was only now understanding how far he'd actually been from the full picture, even when he'd thought he was close. Okay, he said. He said it the way you say a word, when you need to put something down and move on. What do you need from me now? What they needed, it turned, was for him to go through every access report he had filed in the past 18 months and annotate it with context that only he would have the reasons he'd flagged certain patterns, alternative explanations he'd considered and discarded, the specific technical knowledge that had led him to certain conclusions over others. It was meticulous work, the kind that required his full attention and left no space for anything else, which Nathan found he was grateful for. Gabe from IT worked beside him for part of it, pulling up the original system logs to cross-reference Nathan's annotations against the raw data. Gabe was quiet and precise, and twice caught a cross-reference error that Nathan had made because he was tired, and both times he did it without comment. just flagged it gently and moved on. Nathan thanked him the second time, and Gabe said, "Yeah, of course," in the tone of someone for whom careful work was its own point. At 5:47, Nathan's phone buzzed. Mrs. Okafor, his neighbor, texting to say that Emma had arrived and was eating crackers and watching something on the television and was perfectly happy. Nathan texted back a thank you and a promise to be there by 7, and then sat for a moment with his phone in his hand, thinking about crackers and television and the specific quality of Emma's perfectly happy. At 6:15, the 12th floor conference room door opened and Avery Sinclair came in. She wasn't supposed to be there. Nathan thought, not in the sense that anyone had told her not to be, but in the sense that the 12th floor had become an informal task force workspace, and the executive floor was where she was expected to stay. She had apparently decided that expectation didn't apply to her, which was consistent with everything he knew about how she moved through the world. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee from somewhere that wasn't the cafeteria. He could tell by the cups, which had a logo from the place on the ground floor of the building across the street. No. She set one down in front of him without asking and sat in the chair across the table. "Better than what you've been drinking," she said. It wasn't warm, exactly. It was practical, which he thought was more honest anyway. He looked at the cup, then he picked it up. She was right, it was substantially better than what he'd been drinking. Gabe looked at his screen with the practiced attention of someone deciding this was a good moment to focus entirely on his work. "How much do you know?" Nathan asked her. "More than I knew this morning," Avery said. "Less than I probably should." She held her own cup with both hands. She looked different. From this morning, not diminished, exactly, but reduced to something more essential. The particular kind of CEO composure that had been in the room on the 14th floor at 11:17 had been replaced by something that was just a person sitting across a table. "Harriet has been walking me through the investigative findings as they're being confirmed. Park showed me the full data chain an hour ago. And it's worse than I understood this morning." She said it directly, without softening it. "Derek has been doing this for, they think, almost 2 years. The Orion Lake file is the most recent. Before that, there were 4 other acquisition-related data packages that went out. I knew we'd lost 2 deals in the past 18 months that I couldn't entirely explain. I told myself it was market conditions." She stopped. "It wasn't market conditions." "No," Nathan said. "It wasn't. The Orion Lake deal is salvageable. Barely. Harriet is on the phone with counterparty counsel now, trying to establish whether the transmitted file has been acted on yet. If we move fast enough, we might be able to put enough protection around the remaining terms to close." She looked at her coffee. "What about the 2 you already lost?" She looked up at him. "Gone," she said. 2 years of work and the relationships that went with them. He held that. It was a significant loss. He understood enough about how the company operated to grasp the weight of it. And it had happened because 2 people who sat on the 14th floor had spent 2 years systematically selling what she'd spent years building. He'd intervened and had done it while attending her meetings and sitting at her conference table and nodding at the right moments. "Trusted them," he said. "Not as an accusation, as a fact." "Yes," she said. "I did." And then after a pause, "The same way I trusted the footage this morning. Because I had a relationship with the source, and the evidence matched what I expected to see, and I didn't slow down enough to ask whether those 2 things were enough." Nathan looked at her. "They're not the same thing." She agreed. "They're not, but they come from the same place in me. Part that makes decisions quickly and believes that's a strength." She set down her cup. Strength, sometimes. And today it was not. It was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had weight. "I've been thinking about Emma all afternoon," Avery said. Came out slightly differently from how everything else she'd said had come out a fraction less controlled. "Your daughter. You mentioned her this afternoon, when I mentioned her. I just." He stopped. "Have a younger sister. She's 24. I basically raised her from the time she was 12 because our parents weren't able to." She looked at the table. "What it costs to be responsible for someone that small, while also trying to hold everything else together. What the math looks like every month and how little room there is when something unexpected happens." She looked up. "I knew that, and I still put you on that sidewalk without a question. And that's the part I can't rationalize." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He'd been carrying a version of this conversation's intonation in his head all afternoon, the things he might say, the things he was owed the chance to say. And sitting here now, across from a person who was not performing contrition but was simply being in it, he found that the things he'd imagined saying didn't quite fit the room. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," he said, "because it isn't. But I understand the difference between a person who made a bad decision and a person who meant to cause harm. What happened this morning was the first thing." She nodded. "What I need," Nathan said, "is for it to not disappear into process, into HR language and formal resolutions and things that get filed and forgotten. What happened this morning happened in front of the whole building. There are people out there who saw me hand over my badge and walk through that lobby." She said, "I've been thinking about that too. Because those people, the ones who watch, they're going to take something away from what they saw. Either they take away that I did something wrong and got caught, or they take away the truth. The way that gets determined isn't by anything that happens in this conference room. By what you do next, publicly." Avery looked at him steadily. She said for the third time, and this time it carried something that the previous two hadn't, not just acknowledgement, but commitment, the kind that you could feel the weight of. "I'm going to make it right." He'd heard that on the 14th floor corridor earlier, and he'd believed it, then in a provisional sort of way. He believed it more now, sitting in the specific honesty of this smaller room, with the bad lighting and the abandoned sandwich and the task force work spread across the table. "All right," he said. She looked at his paperwork. At the annotated access reports spread across the table, the timeline Gabe had been building on the laptop, the cross-referenced log entries, with Nathan's handwritten notes in the margins. "How much more do you have to do tonight?" she asked. "Couple more hours, maybe. Marsh wants the full annotation set by morning." "Go home," she said. "See your daughter. Send Marsh what you have now, and finish the rest in the morning." He looked at her. "That's not your call." "No," she said, "but I'm going to make it anyway, and you can choose whether to take it." A pause. "You've been in this building since 8 this morning, and a significant amount has happened since then. Home. The rest of this will still be here." Nathan looked at Gabe, who had found something extremely fascinating on his screen and was not making eye contact with anyone. He looked at the paperwork. He thought about Emma eating crackers in Mrs. Okafor's apartment and the particular way she would look up when he came through the door, that specific expression she had, that was trying to be cool but couldn't quite hold it. 2 more hours, he said. "Then I'm done for tonight." He left the building at 8:12. Different from the morning, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but differently in the way the same street feels different at different times, depending on what you know. The March air was colder now. The avenue traffic had thinned to the evening rhythm. The 7 black SUVs were gone from the curb, replaced by the ordinary nighttime arrangement of a city moving through itself. He walked to his car in the parking structure and sat in it for a moment before starting it, doing anything. Just being in the specific quiet of a car in a parking structure, which has a quality unlike any other quiet, enclosed and echoing all at once. He thought about what Marsh had said. Your instincts were right. He thought about the last 18 months of doubting them, of talking himself down from the ledge of his own certainty when authority told him to, thinking too many times that maybe he was the problem for seeing patterns that other people couldn't or wouldn't see. He thought about Derek Holt's face in the moment before he asked for an attorney, the specific crack in the confidence. He thought about Marcus Webb, who hadn't been confronted yet, who was somewhere in this building or elsewhere in the city carrying everything he knew and figuring out what to do with it. Thought about the man in the dark suit who had just sat in Avery's office and watched him hand over his badge and said nothing, which was somehow the part of the whole day that he found he couldn't put down entirely, the deliberateness of it. Yet, the person who had been planted in that room not to participate but simply to witness that a particular thing had been accomplished. Nathan started the car. He pulled out of the structure and into the evening street and drove north toward home, toward Mrs. Koss' apartment, Okafor's apartment, and the crackers and the television and the daughter who was perfectly happy and didn't know what kind of day her father had lived through, who would climb into his lap when he walked in the way she still did, sometimes, even though she was 8 and considered herself quite mature, and who would probably fall asleep on him on the couch before 9 o'clock. Yes, he drove through the city's evening light and thought about the report he had written 3 months ago, the one that Webb had read and handed to Holt and used to protect the very thing Nathan had been trying to expose. He thought about how that moment, Webb reading his words and making the call to Holt, had probably felt like a victory for them. Problem handled. A cautious employee redirected. They had used his report as a tool against itself. That report was in the hands of federal investigators, annotated in his own handwriting, forming part of the evidentiary foundation for what was coming. Was something in that, Nathan thought. Something he didn't have a clean word for. Satisfaction, exactly. Not the simple pleasure of being proven right. Something more complicated and less tidy, the feeling of a thing having traveled a long distance to arrive at its actual destination, and the understanding that the distance had cost something real, and the acknowledgement that the cost was paid, and the arrival had happened anyway. Stopped at a light 4 blocks from Mrs. Okafor's building. Pedestrians moved across the crosswalk. A woman in a yellow coat. A man walking a dog that couldn't decide which direction it wanted to go. 2 teenagers side by side looking at the same phone. The light changed. Nathan drove, and on the 14th floor of a building behind him, in an office that had been sealed and placed under investigative hold, the desk that Derek Holt had sat behind for 9 years held nothing now but a family photograph in the right frame and the gathered dark of an empty room. And somewhere in the building's server logs, patient and precise, the original unaltered footage of an empty corridor sat waiting for the morning and the next step, and the full accounting that was now finally underway. Emma was asleep on Mrs. Okafor's couch when Nathan got there. She had her shoes off and her socks on, and she was curled sideways with one arm under her cheek and the television going at low volume in front of her, showing a nature documentary about ocean creatures that she had clearly been watching with great interest right up until the moment she wasn't. Mrs. Okafor was in the kitchen making tea, and she looked at Nathan when he came through the door with the particular expression of a woman in her 60s who has seen enough of life to read a person's day in their face without being told anything. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make you a cup. I'm fine, I just need to—" "Sit down, Nathan." He sat down at her kitchen table. It was a small table with a plastic tablecloth that had a pattern of sunflowers on it, and 4 chairs that didn't match each other. Mrs. Okafor had lived in the apartment 2 doors down for as long as Nathan had lived in the building, which was 6 years, and in that time she had fed him dinner approximately 40 times, and listened to him talk about Emma approximately 300 times, and never once offered him advice he hadn't asked for, which was the quality he appreciated most about her. She set a cup of tea in front of him. She sat across the table with her own cup. "Day," she said. It wasn't a question. "Strange day," he said. "Started bad. Got stranger. Emma said you called the school." "I did." "She wasn't worried," Mrs. Okafor said. "She told me you always call when you're going to be late. She said you're very reliable about that." Something about that hit Nathan in a place he hadn't expected. He looked at the sunflower tablecloth and didn't say anything for a moment. "She said that," he said, word for word. Mrs. Okafor drank her tea. "She also told me about butterflies tasting with their feet. Apparently this is important information. It came up this morning too. She's fixated on it. I think it might be a school project." Nathan drank his tea. It was the kind of tea that had been steeped a little too long and was slightly bitter but warm all the way down. And it was exactly what he needed, and he didn't say that because he didn't need to. He carried Emma home at 9:15. She stirred when he picked her up, but didn't fully wake, made a small sound, and settled her head against his shoulder with the total lack of self-consciousness that children have when they trust where they're being taken. He got her into her bed and pulled the covers up and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She had a poster of the solar system on her wall that she'd gotten at a science museum 2 years ago and still considered one of her most important possessions. She had a shelf of books that were arranged in a system that made sense only to her. She had a stuffed animal that had lost one eye and whose stuffing was compressed in a way that suggested it had been carried everywhere for several years, which was accurate. Nathan stood in the doorway and looked at all of this and thought about the 14 hours that had just happened, and the versions of this moment that hadn't come to pass, the version where he was still on that sidewalk, still figuring out what to tell her, still doing the math on swim lessons and grocery bills with no paycheck coming. Turned off her light and went to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed and stared at nothing for approximately 4 minutes. Then he lay down without changing clothes and was asleep in under 2 minutes, which was either a sign of exhaustion or pragmatism or both. Call from Marsh came at 7:43 the next morning, while Nathan was making Emma's waffle and thinking about whether he had enough of the good coffee or was going to have to use the cheap grounds again. "We confronted Webb this morning," Marsh said. 6:30 at his home. Nathan moved the waffle iron away from Emma's reach out of habit. "How did it go?" "About how you predicted," Marsh said. "He came in minimizing, spent the first 20 minutes saying he'd received your reports and made a judgment call, that they didn't rise to the level of escalation, that security management involved a degree of professional discretion, that he had no knowledge of any criminal activity on Holt's part." And then Park laid out the communication records. A pause. "There are 14 direct messages between Webb and Holt in the 72 hours following your first access irregularity report.
Yeah.
Content of those messages is unambiguous. Webb told Holt specifically which credential IDs you had flagged. He told him which access events you documented. He advised him on how to modify the pattern going forward." Nathan said nothing. "Webb is cooperating now," Marsh said. "Fully. He's trying to position himself as secondary. Holt initiated the operation. Holt brought him in. Holt made the payments. Webb's argument is that he was complicit, but not the architect." "Is that true?" "Partially," Marsh said. "The evidence suggests Holt built the operation and recruited Webb approximately 8 months in, when he needed the internal cover. Webb made a choice. He made it more than once. He said he'd intervened. And the choice he made with your reports was the most direct. He took information you gave him in good faith and handed it to the person you were trying to document." Nathan listened to the waffle iron for a moment, the sound it made when it was almost done. "What happens to him?" Nathan asked. "That's for prosecutors to work out with his attorney. He'll face charges. The cooperation will affect the outcome, but it won't eliminate the consequence." Marsh paused. "I wanted you to hear this from me before you came in today, because some of what we're going to need from you this morning relates directly to Webb's role, and I thought you deserved to know the shape of it first." "I appreciate that," Nathan said. Emma came into the kitchen in her pajamas, hair going in 3 directions, and looked at the waffle iron with the specific focused interest of someone for whom breakfast was a serious matter. Nathan held up one finger. "Give me a minute," and she accepted without complaint, and went to get the syrup from the cabinet, which she considered her domain. "I'll be in by 9, Nathan told Marsh. "Take your time," Marsh said. "The work isn't going anywhere." He was at the building by 8:50, which was earlier than take your time, but later than his usual 8, and Delia at the front desk gave him a look that was entirely different from the one she'd given him yesterday morning. Yesterday's look had been the careful, neutral look of someone maintaining professional distance from a situation. Today's look was something else, not warm. Delia was not a warm person. It had a quality of acknowledgement in it, the particular nod of someone who tracked how things turned out and had updated their records. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Morning, Delia." She handed him a visitor pass. He looked at it, a temporary pass, which made sense since his permanent credentials had been revoked. He clipped it to his lanyard and felt the particular strangeness of the weight being slightly wrong. Not much, just slightly. Harriet Lowe was waiting for him in the lobby, which he hadn't expected. She was a compact and efficient woman, and she moved like someone who had places to be and had already calculated the optimal route to all of them. She shook his hand. "Mr. Cole, Avery would like to see you before you go up to the task force floor, if you're amenable." "Is this a legal conversation?" he asked. "It can be," she said. "Or it can just be a conversation. That's somewhat up to you." He thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "Let's make it just a conversation," he said, "for now." Yeah, Avery's office on the 14th floor was different this morning. In small ways, the folder from yesterday was gone. The desk was clearer, yet, and there was evidence of a night that had been longer than usual in the quality of the light around Avery's eyes. She was put together, because she was always put together, but the version of put together in front of him now had been assembled with slightly more deliberate effort than usual, and he could see the seams of it. She was standing when he came in, same as yesterday. But it read differently today. Yesterday she'd been standing because she was holding authority. Newms, today she was standing because she was the kind of person who didn't sit when she had something difficult to say. Thank you for coming up, she said. I was coming in anyway, he said. She looked at him directly. I want to make you an offer. And I want to make it clearly and without pressure. Because the last time I made a unilateral decision about your employment situation in this room, it was a disaster, and I'm trying not to repeat myself. He sat down. She didn't this time. She moved to the window, the same window she'd been standing at yesterday when these SUVs had pulled up, and she looked out at the city for a moment before turning back. We want to offer you your position back, she said. Full reinstatement, seniority intact, no gap in the record. Everything that happened yesterday expunged formally from your personnel file. Additionally, a promotion to Director of Corporate Security, a role that will be newly created with genuine authority, budget control, and a direct reporting line to me, filtered through any other executive. She paused. And financial compensation for what happened yesterday. Harriet has worked up a figure that she believes is appropriate. I think it's probably not enough, but it's the number she gave me, and I trust her math more than I trust mine. Nathan looked at her. That's a significant offer. It's the offer you deserve, she said. The question is whether you want it. He looked at the window. At the city behind her, the March light falling differently than it had yesterday, warmer, or maybe just the same, and he was reading it differently. I have conditions, he said. I expected that. Not about the title or the compensation. He looked at her. I want something built. A program. Specifically an emergency assistance fund for employees in financial crisis. Targeted at people who are one unexpected event away from not being able to manage. Single parents, people carrying family medical costs, people who are working full-time at this company and still can't absorb a gap in pay or an unplanned expense. He paused. What that feels like from the inside. I've been that person. And yesterday, for about 40 minutes on that sidewalk, I was living through what it would feel like for that person to suddenly have nothing. Avery was very still. I don't want the experience to be about me, Nathan continued. I don't want a settlement that goes into my account and disappears. I want something that stays, something structural that exists after I'm gone, after you're gone. That means someone else in this company doesn't have to sit on a sidewalk doing the math on whether their kids' swim lessons are survivable. The room was quiet for a moment. Avery turned from the window. She walked to her desk and sat down. Yes, for the first time in this conversation, she looked like herself, not the assembled version of herself. The version that was managing a difficult situation just herself, which was a person who had not become the CEO of an 1,100-person company by failing to recognize when someone in front of her was saying something worth hearing. How much are you thinking? She said. I don't know the number. That's your domain, not mine. But it should be real, symbolic, not the kind of fund that gets established for a press release and then sits there with a quarterly budget of $8,000 and a committee that meets twice a year. He met her eyes. Real enough that it actually helps someone. Harriet, Avery said. Harriet Lowe, who had been standing near the door with the specific quality of someone who was present but professionally absent, looked up. Get me a framework for this by end of week, Avery said. Genuine operating budget, eligibility criteria, an application process that doesn't humiliate people. We'll call it... She stopped and looked at Nathan. Don't name it after me, he said immediately. Something crossed her face that was almost a smile. I wasn't going to, she said. I was going to ask what you thought it should be called. He thought about it. About the sidewalk yesterday. About the 40 minutes between losing his badge and the moment Marsh's vehicle pulled up. And what those 40 minutes had contained. The second chance fund, he said. Because that's what it is. Everybody deserves one. Harriet wrote it down. Avery looked at Nathan across the desk, the same desk where she'd held out her hand for his badge 20 hours ago. And there was something in her expression that wasn't apology and wasn't exactly gratitude. Sat somewhere between them in the complicated territory of two people who had just learned something real about each other in the worst possible way. I'll accept the reinstatement, Nathan said, and the director position, because I think I can actually do good work in it. He paused. The financial compensation put half of it into the fund's initial endowment. Use my name as the founding contribution if it helps the paperwork. Use my name publicly. Avery nodded slowly. And I need one more thing, Nathan said. The building, he said. What happened yesterday happened in front of the whole company. People watched me walk through that lobby. I need you to address it, not a memo, not a quiet HR notice. Something that tells the people company helped without making it a spectacle, but clearly nobody is left with the impression that I did something wrong. Avery held his gaze. I was going to do that regardless, she said. Today, in fact. I'm sending a company-wide communication this afternoon. Harriet drafted it this morning. She paused. I'd like you to read it before it goes out. That would be appropriate, he said. He reached across the desk, not to shake her hand. It wasn't that kind of moment, but to take the single sheet of paper she was sliding toward him, which was the preliminary outline of what would become his employment offer. He looked at it briefly. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. I'll have Harriet draw up the formal agreements, Avery said. I'll have someone look at them, Nathan said. He didn't have an attorney, but he knew someone from the Caldwell-Orion days who still owed him a favor, and today seemed like the right time to call it in. He stood. She stood. They stood across the desk from each other, in the office where yesterday's version of this had gone so completely wrong, and the space between them had a quality that neither of them tried to characterize, because some things are better left without names while they're still forming. I want to ask you something, Avery said. She said it in a way that suggested she'd been holding it for a while. Go ahead. The report you submitted 3 months ago. When Webb responded, and it went nowhere, why did you stay? She looked at him steadily. You could have escalated externally. You knew something was wrong. You had enough to at least make noise. Why did you stay in the building and keep doing the job? Nathan thought about that honestly. Emma, he said. Partly. The job was steady, and I needed steady. He paused. And partly because I'm the kind of person who thinks if you see something wrong in a place, the answer is to fix it from inside, not to leave it for someone else. He looked at her. That's probably a flaw. It's how the report got written in the first place, she said. If you'd left, we wouldn't have the documentation chain. He said, things work out in directions you don't predict. He left her office and walked down the corridor, toward the elevator, past the sealed door of Derek Holt's office and the open door of Marcus Webb's, which now had an investigative seal across its frame and 2 boxes of documents stacked outside it, waiting for chain of custody processing. He walked past without slowing. The next several hours were less dramatic than everything that had preceded them, which Nathan found he was grateful for. He worked with Marcia's team through the morning, finishing the annotation set he'd started the day before and adding context to 3 additional report sequences that the investigators had identified as relevant. Park asked him technical questions about the credential architecture that Nathan answered precisely and without editorializing. Reyes came through twice to clarify timeline details. The work was careful and methodical and required his full concentration, which was its own kind of relief. At noon, Harriet Lowe sent the company-wide communication from Avery's office. Nathan read it before it went out, as agreed. It was 11 sentences. It said, without naming names beyond his own, that Nathan Cole had been wrongly identified as a subject of an internal security incident, that the evidence used to support that identification had been deliberately falsified by parties now under federal investigation, that Nathan's record contained no wrongdoing of any kind and reflected 6 years of exemplary service, and that he would be returning to the company in an expanded capacity effective immediately. It said that the incident had been a serious failure of the company's internal review process and that steps were being taken to address it. It did not use the word sorry, because corporate communications never do, but the architecture of it said the thing without the word. Nathan read it twice. He gave it back to Harriet and said it was fine. She nodded and sent it. He found out later from Gabe that the communication had more responses in the company's internal feedback channel than any message in the past 2 years. He didn't ask what the responses said. He thought he could more or less guess, and he wasn't sure he needed to hold all of that. At 2:15, Marsh found him in the conference room, with a look on his face that Nathan had learned in the past 30 hours meant something significant had developed. The broker, Marsh said. The man in the dark suit from Sinclair's office yesterday. Nathan set down his pen. We have him, Marsh said. He tried to move on the Orion Lake file last night, made contact with the buyer to arrange the delivery. We'd already flagged the buyer's communication channels. When he made contact, we had everything we needed. He sat down across the table. His name is Raymond Cass. He's been operating as a data broker for we think at least 11 years. Meridian is his fourth known operation of this type. The other three were in different industries, different cities. He's been doing this for 11 years, Nathan said. Professionally, Marsh said. This is what he does. Nathan thought about Raymond Cass sitting in Avery's office yesterday morning, reading whatever he'd been reading, completely still, watching Nathan hand over his badge. Professional. Someone for whom Nathan's career and Emma's swim lessons and the 40 minutes on the sidewalk were just a logistical detail in a larger operation. Is he in custody? Nathan asked. As of 40 minutes ago, Marsh said. Nathan nodded. He picked up his pen. He looked at the report in front of him and found his place and kept working because the work needed to be finished and it wasn't going to finish itself. And some things you just keep doing even after the thing you were afraid of has been handled. 4 o'clock, he called the attorney from the Caldwell Orion days, a woman named Patricia, who had moved from corporate law to general practice and who picked up on the second ring and listened to his summary without interrupting, and then said, send me the documents tonight, and I'll look at them in the morning. And Nathan, I'm glad you called. He thanked her and meant it. At 5:30, he took his temporary visitor pass off his lanyard and set it on the desk in front of Reyes, and said he thought they probably had everything they needed from him for today. She agreed that they did. She shook his hand and told him he had been helpful, which was the kind of thing Reyes said and meant. Yo, and he believed her. He picked up his jacket. He looked around the conference room, the round table, the mismatched chairs, the window onto the courtyard. The abandoned sandwich had finally been removed at some point during the afternoon by someone who had decided enough was enough. No, table was clear. He walked out through the lobby. Delia had gone home already. The evening desk person was someone Nathan recognized but didn't know well, who gave him a neutral nod as he passed. He pushed through the front doors and stepped out onto the evening street. The city was doing what it always did. No, buses and taxis and people moving home from work. The particular shift in the air quality between day and evening that Nathan had always liked something settling about it. Something that suggested the active part of things was giving way to the quiet part. A man walked past, eating something from a paper bag. A woman in a yellow coat, not the same one from last night, or maybe it was. The city ricicled its colors crossed against the light in the specific way of someone who had made a calculation and felt good about it. Nathan stood on the steps of the building for a moment. Thought about standing here yesterday morning. The empty lanyard clip. The 7 vehicles. Marsh walking toward him with the particular deliberate pace of someone who already knew more than you did and was about to change the shape of your day entirely. He thought about Emma, who was at school right now finishing her afternoon and who would be picked up by the regular after-school arrangement and would be home by 5:50 and would probably be doing homework by the time he got there, or would be doing something she was calling homework that was actually reading about biology or butterflies or whatever had captured her attention this week. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the preliminary offer sheet Avery had given him that morning. He looked at it, the director title, the compensation figure, the line that said founding contribution to Second Chance Fund with the blank for the amount. He folded it back up and put it in his pocket. He thought about what Marsh had said. Your instincts were right. He thought about the 18 months of doubting them. He was not going to spend a lot of time on the distance between those two things because he was not built for retrospective suffering. And it wasn't useful. And Emma needed help with her long division tonight, which he knew because she texted him 3 separate times about it during his lunch break, in a sequence that went from confident to frustrated to resigned over approximately 40 minutes. He had a daughter who texted him about long division. He had a job to go back to, a real one, with authority and budget, and a direct line to the person at the top. He had a fund that was going to be built and named the Second Chance Fund, and funded with real money, and structured to actually help people, which was the thing he had asked for and received, which seemed to him In this particular moment, on these particular steps, the most important outcome of the whole 2 days. He walked to his car. The parking structure was quieter at this hour. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. He got in, put on his seatbelt, sat for a moment in the particular quiet of the structure, took out his phone and texted Emma, "On my way. I can help with the long division." "Save it." She replied in under 30 seconds, which meant she'd been watching for it. Finally, his side been suffering. He looked at that for a second. He put the phone in his pocket. He started the car and drove home through the evening city. Light was the particular amber of late afternoon, giving up to early evening, and the traffic was the kind of thick that moved anyway. And somewhere in his jacket pocket was a piece of paper that was going to change a significant number of things. Tomorrow morning, he was going to drink better coffee and drop his daughter at school and come back to a building where people now knew for the right reasons, and none of it was clean or simple or fully resolved, because nothing ever was. But it was real. All of it was real, and moving forward, and his was enough. The long division took 45 minutes. Because Emma couldn't do it, she could, and she knew she could. But she had developed a habit of second-guessing herself at the last step that turned a 2-minute problem into a 10-minute exercise in talking herself back from the edge of her own doubt. Nathan sat at the kitchen table across from her and watched her work and give her and did not tell she was wrong when she was wrong, only asked her to walk him through her reasoning out loud, which was a technique he'd stumbled onto about a year ago that worked better than anything else he'd tried. "If I divide 42 by 6, she said, staring at her paper with the expression of someone negotiating with it, "I get 7. "You get 7, he confirmed. "But then I bring down that." She stopped. "I already brought it down." "You did." She looked at him. "So I'm done?" "Check it," he said. She checked it. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: doubt, calculation, particular focused squint she'd had since she was a toddler, and then something opening up. "I'm done," she said. "I got it right." "You got it right on your own," he said. "I didn't do anything." "You sat there," he said, which was apparently sufficient contribution in her accounting. He made dinner while she finished the rest of her homework pasta again, but this time with the actual sauce he'd made on Sunday and kept in the refrigerator, which Emma isn't significantly superior to the jar version and had opinions about in the way she had opinions about most things. She talked while she ate, the stream of consciousness reporting that she did at dinner, moving from the long division to something that had happened at recess, to a book, to a question about whether sharks could get diseases. Nathan answered as accurately as he could and promised to look up the rest. He did not tell her what had happened. Not that night. She was 8, and the full shape of the past 2 days was not something he was going to put on an 8-year-old who was worried about sick sharks and had just successfully completed her long division. There would be a version of it, simplified and age-appropriate at some point. Tonight, she went to bed at 8:30. He checked on her at 9:15 and she was already asleep, the solar system poster on her wall catching the light from the hallway in a way that made the planets glow faintly. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he had the night before, and the night before that, every night for 8 years, the specific ritual of making sure she was there and fine and breathing, which never got less important no matter how many times he did it. He went to bed, and for the first time in several nights, he slept without waking up at 3 a.m. to think about things he couldn't resolve in the dark. Patricia called at 8 the next morning, while he was in the car, after dropping Emma at school. She had read the documents. She had opinions. The director title is appropriate, she said, and the reporting structure is good direct line. To the CEO is the right call. The compensation figure is fair, but I think there's room to negotiate the fund contribution upward. And I want different language in the non-disparagement clause, because the current version is too broad in a way that could limit you if you ever need to discuss the investigation publicly in a legal context. "Can you fix the language?" he asked. "That's what you called me for," she said. "I'll send them red lines today." "Nathan, this is a solid offer. They want you back, and they know it. Don't undersell." "I'm not underselling," he said. "I just don't want to spend the next 6 months in a negotiation," she said. 2 rounds, maybe 3. Harriet Lowe knows what she's doing, and she's not going to play games. This gets done by end of next week if everyone moves reasonably. He thanked her and hung up and sat in the school parking lot for a moment, longer than usual, listening to the engine idle. 2 rounds, maybe 3. End of next week. 6 days ago, he hadn't known any of this was coming. He'd been making the cheap coffee and running the badge rotation schedule and trying to remember to buy the good grounds. Thing about the way life changed, the real significant changes, not the small daily ones, was that they almost never announced themselves. They arrived without adequate preparation time, in the middle of a Tuesday, wearing the face of a disaster until they turned around. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove to Meridian. The building felt different to him now, walking through the lobby. Dramatically different. Delia was still at her desk. The marble floor was still clean. The atrium still had its particular quality of design confidence. The way Nathan moved through it had shifted in some small way he couldn't precisely name. Like a person passing through a space that belonged to someone else, and more like a person whose relationship to the was about to change in a way that gave him a different kind of standing in it. He went to the 12th floor first, out of habit. Conference room that had been the task force workspace for 2 days was quieter. Now Marsh's team had reduced its presence. The document cases were fewer. Park's second laptop was gone from the table. Reyes was still there, working through something on her own computer with the same focused energy she'd brought to everything else. "Mr. Coles," she said. "How's it going?" he asked. "We're in the documentation phase," she said, which meant the active investigation had moved to the structured process of building the formal evidentiary case. Holt's attorney made contact with prosecutors yesterday afternoon. Webb's cooperation statement has been fully recorded. She paused. Cass's situation is more complex. His attorney is arguing jurisdictional questions that are going to take some time to resolve. Will they resolve in your favor? Ultimately, yes, she said. It'll take longer than the others. He nodded. Marsh around? He'll be in later. He's at a briefing downtown this morning. She looked at him with the same direct assessment she'd used in the interview 2 days ago. For what it's worth, and I don't say this to everyone, so take it. For what it is, the documentation you gave us was excellent. You're precise and you don't editorialize, and you understand what's evidentiary and what personal interpretation. That's not as common as you'd think. Nathan looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "That means something, coming from you." She nodded once and went back to her screen, which was as close to warmth as Reyes got, and which he had come to understand was actually a significant gesture from someone who spent most of her professional energy on the work itself rather than on the relationships around it. He went upstairs. The 14th floor was operating at something close to its normal rhythm when Nathan came off the elevator, which surprised him slightly, the particular hum of an executive floor doing its work, phones and conversations, and the movement of people with purpose. He had expected more disruption, more visible signs of what had happened. Instead, the floor seemed to be doing what floors do after something significant occurs, which is absorb it and keep moving, because the alternative is not practical. There were signs, if you knew where to look. Holt's office door was still sealed with an investigative notice. Webb's office had been cleared out entirely, not just sealed but emptied, the nameplate removed from beside the door. The boxes of documents Nathan had seen 2 days ago, now gone to wherever evidence went when it was formally processed. 2 empty offices at the end of the corridor gave the floor a slightly different proportion, like a sentence with 2 words removed. Avery's assistant waved him through without the formal announcement process. Avery was at her desk, actually working, which distinguished this morning from the previous 2 times he'd been in this office when she'd been performing a version of working while dealing with something more urgent. She finished whatever she was reading before she looked up. "Patricia Garland sent red lines to Harriet this morning," Nathan said. "Harriet told me." She gestured at the chair across from her desk. "Sit down. The language issues she flagged are reasonable. The fund contribution number she's proposing is higher than what we offered, but it's not unreasonable, and frankly, I was underfunding it anyway." He sat. "So we're close." "We're close," she agreed. "Harriet wants one more pass at the non-disparagement scope, and then she thinks we're done." She folded her hands on her desk. "I also want to talk to you about the transition. Who's covering your current responsibilities while we formalize the director role. Whether you want to do a formal handover, or if you'd rather build the director scope from scratch and leave the day-to-day security coordination to someone we promote internally. I have a recommendation for the day-to-day, Nathan said. Gabe. She looked at him. From IT, he's been doing half the security analysis work for the past year and a half without the title or the compensation. He's precise, he's discreet. He caught 2 errors in my own documentation on Wednesday that I'd missed. The system's better than anyone in the building except me. Nathan paused. He also noticed something was wrong a long time ago and kept his head down because nobody gave him a channel to raise it. That's worth something. Avery made a note. I'll have HR pull his file. Just pull his file, Nathan said. Talk to him. He's not a file. She looked up at him with an expression that was briefly something like amused, though she controlled it quickly. All right, she said. I'll talk to him. There was a pause. Kind of pause that happens when the business portion of a conversation has been addressed, and what's left is the other portion, which is harder to organize. Company-wide communication, Nathan said. The response to it. Yes. She said it without flinching, which he appreciated. Harriet showed me the numbers. 312 individual responses in the internal channel. I read every one of them, Avery said. He looked at her. That's more than I expected from you. I'm not sure whether to be offended by that, she said. It's not an insult. Most CEOs held 300 responses to an internal communication. CEOs didn't fire the wrong person in front of their entire company on a Tuesday, she said. Yes, he'd intervened. It came out with more edge than she'd intended, and she knew it. He could see the slight adjustment in her expression, the acknowledgement that she'd said something more raw than polished. She didn't walk it back. I read them because I owed it to the people who took the time to write them. What happened affected more than you. It affected everyone who watched it happen and drew conclusions from it about how this company operates and whether it's a place where they're safe to do their jobs. She looked at the desk. Some of those responses were people saying they'd had similar experiences, with accusations as serious as this, but with being dismissed before being heard, with raising concerns that went nowhere. A pause. There are things I need to look at in how we operate that go beyond what happened to you specifically. Nathan thought about the responses he hadn't read. Yes, he'd intervened. The 312 people in this building who had watched him walk through the lobby on Tuesday and had something to say about it 2 days later. He thought about what Avery had just said, people saying they'd had similar experiences, and felt the particular weight of a thing being bigger than its most visible instance. That's part of what the fund should address, he said. Just financial crisis. The whole structure of how people in this company raise concerns, and whether those concerns go anywhere. He looked at her. The Second Chance Fund is a financial tool, but the problem underneath it is a culture problem. People weren't talking because they didn't think it would help, she said. Building the fund is the right start. It's not the whole thing. I know that too, she said. He said it, he'd intervened. She said it without defensiveness, which told him she had already been sitting with this and wasn't hearing it for the first time from him. This is why I want the director role to have real authority. Ceremonial. Real oversight with real access and a real voice in executive decisions that affect security and operations. She looked at him directly. I need someone who will tell me what I don't want to hear. I've had too many people around me who told me what I wanted to hear, and 2 of them have federal charges pending. Nathan held her gaze. I'm not diplomatic, he said. I'll be clear about that now. I'll do this job the way I've always done it, which means I'll tell you what always done it, which means I'll tell you what I see, and I'll document what I flag, and I won't soften it because it's uncomfortable. Good, she said. That's what I'm hiring for. He nodded. She nodded. It wasn't a warm moment. It wasn't the kind of relationship that produced warm moments yet, and maybe it never would be in that particular way. But it was an honest one, which was worth considerably more. Marsh came back from his downtown briefing at 11 and found Nathan in the 12th floor conference room, working through the final portion of the documentation set. He set a coffee down from the place across the street, not the cafeteria, which Nathan had come to understand was Marsh's standard because he was 63 years old and had earned the right to good coffee during federal investigations. How are you doing? Marsh asked. He'd asked the same question on the first day. The answer was different now. Better, Nathan said. Because it was Marsh, I keep thinking about the 48 hours after my report. Holt adjusting the operation. Webb making the call to tell him. Marsh settled into the chair across the table. That'll stick for a while, he said. It's the kind of thing that does. Does it get easier to accept that you did the right thing and someone used it against you anyway? Marsh was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of person who didn't answer questions before he'd actually considered them. You don't accept it, he said. You don't have to. What happened was wrong. The people who did it are going to face the consequences of it. He drank his coffee. What changes is that you stop needing the acceptance. You understand what you did and why you did it, and that becomes the part that matters. The rest is just circumstance. Terrible circumstance, but circumstance. Nathan thought about that. You've had cases like this before. A few, Marsh said. People who did everything right and got burned for it. People whose good work got swallowed up by the machinery of the thing they were trying to expose. He set down his cup. The ones who come out of it cleanest aren't the ones who get angry. They're the ones who stay focused on what the work actually was. You were trying to protect this company. You did that. The fact that it took a federal investigation to surface what you'd already found doesn't diminish what you found. Nathan looked at the documentation in front of him. 18 months of careful, precise, quietly ignored work, sitting in an organized evidentiary set that would form part of the foundation of 3 separate federal prosecutions. The work he'd done had mattered. It had just mattered in a direction and at a scale he hadn't anticipated. When does the investigation formally close? He asked. The immediate phase Holt, Webb, Cass that'll move into prosecution over the next 3 to 6 months. Cass will take longer. The broader financial crimes picture the buyers, the network he was operating through that's ongoing, probably 2 years minimum. Marsh looked at him. You may be called to testify, almost certainly will be, for Holt and Webb. Your documentation and your direct knowledge of the operational context are significant. I figured, Nathan said. I'll be there. I know you will, Marsh said. He said things simply. He said it the way he said things simply, with the weight of someone who had made a lot of assessments of a lot of people over a long career and had gotten reasonably good at it. You've been good to work with, Nathan. I don't say that pro forma. Nathan looked at him. Gerald Marsh, 63, silver-haired, overcoat that had seen better decades. He'd intervened the most competent person he'd encountered in 2 days that had contained a significant number of competent people. Thank you for coming when you did, Nathan said. 11 more minutes on that sidewalk, and I'd have driven home. Marsh almost smiled fully this time. Almost. We would have found you, he said. But I'm glad you found me there. The formal agreements were signed the following Thursday. Patricia and Harriet went 2 rounds on the non-disparagement language, as predicted, and arrived at wording that both of them found acceptable, which meant it was probably the right answer. The fund contribution was increased to a figure that would actually build something real. Nathan signed in Harriet's office, with Patricia on the phone from her car because she had a hearing in the afternoon and couldn't come in person, which was fine. These things didn't require ceremony. Started in the director role the following Monday. What? His office was on the 12th floor, not the 14th, which he hadn't wanted, not the basement security station he'd occupied for 6 years, a midpoint that felt appropriate. The office had a window that looked out over the side street, not the Grand Avenue view of the executive floor, which suited him. The first thing he did was call Gabe and offer him the senior security analyst position that they'd been building since the previous week. Gabe was quiet for a moment on the phone, the specific quiet of someone recalibrating, and then said he'd need to think about it. Nathan told him to take a day. Gabe called back in 4 hours and said yes, and asked if he could keep his current desk in a T because he worked better there. Nathan said that was fine. They'd work out the logistics. The second thing he did was start drafting the second chance fund eligibility criteria. He did this on his own, before Harriet's team built the formal framework, because he wanted the criteria to come from somewhere real, from his own understanding of what a person in genuine financial crisis actually needed, which was different from what an HR department's default assumption about financial crisis looked like. He wanted the application process to not require a person to prove they were desperate before they could get help. He wanted the timeline between application and response to be days, not weeks, because people in financial crisis did not have weeks. He sent the draft to Harriet. She sent back comments. He addressed some of them and pushed back on others. They went back and forth 3 times over 2 weeks, and what emerged at the end of it was something that was neither exactly what Nathan had written nor exactly what Harriet had modified. But a third thing that was better than either was how good collaborative work actually went when both people were serious about the outcome. The fund launched in May. Avery announced it at the company's quarterly all-hands meeting, which Nathan attended in his new capacity and sat in the back for, which was where he preferred to be in large rooms. She explained what it was and how it worked and who it was for, and she said clearly and in front of everyone that the fund existed because of a conversation she'd had with Nathan Cole, and that conversation had happened in the aftermath of a mistake she'd made that she didn't intend to make again. The room was very quiet when she said that. Not uncomfortable quiet. Kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people hear something true, said plainly by someone who didn't intend to say it plainly. Oh. Nathan looked at his hands on the table in front of him and didn't say anything and didn't need to. The first application to the Second Chance Fund came in 8 days later. A woman named Gloria in accounts receivable, 44 years old, single mother of a teenager, facing a gap between what her insurance covered and what her son's surgery was going to cost. The gap was $1,100, which was the kind of number that sounds small until you're the person who doesn't have it. The application was reviewed in 3 days. The assistance was approved. Gloria received a call from HR telling her she was covered. Yes, he'd intervened. Nathan found out about Gloria because Harriet mentioned it in passing during a meeting about something else entirely. He didn't say much in response. Wrote it down in the margin of his notebook, which was full of things he wrote down, not because he needed to remember them, but because writing them made them more real, more fixed, more permanent than a thought that just moved through and kept going. $1,100, a surgery covered. A woman who wouldn't have to make the specific calculation Nathan knew too well, the one where you look at your bank account and look at your child and try to figure out which thing you can sacrifice to take care of the other. He looked at it in his notebook for a moment. Then he went back to the meeting. One evening in late October, Nathan came home department quiet in the specific way that meant Emma was occupied with something she was invested in. He set his bag down and loosened his tie. He wore a tie now. Days, Emma had initially greeted with deep suspicion and had eventually accepted as a feature of the new situation, and found her at the kitchen table, doing homework. She was wrapping something, a small box, badly. The wrapping paper had a pattern of small stars on it, and she had used approximately 3 times as much tape as the project required, and one corner of the paper was folded in a way that wasn't going to resolve itself without being started over, which she had apparently decided was not worth addressing. She looked up when he came in, and he saw immediately that she was doing the things she did when she was pleased with herself, but trying not to show it yet. "What's that?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, which meant something. "Okay," he said. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, and came back to the table and sat down, and he waited, because he had learned a long time ago that with Emma the best strategy was usually to create space and let her fill it in her own time. She lasted about 90 seconds. "It's for you," she said. She slid the box across the table. "It's not Christmas or your birthday. I just wanted to." He looked at her for a moment. She was 8 years old, and she had his eyes and the specific set of her mouth when she was trying not to show how much something mattered to her, which was a thing he recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors. She was going to be a complicated and specific and remarkable person, he thought, not for the first time. She already was. He picked up the box and unwrapped it, which required negotiating the excessive tape more carefully than he would have liked. Inside was a shoebox, a child's shoebox, her size, which told him she had gone to the store with money she'd saved and bought something, repurposed something she owned. He lifted the lid. A pair of shoes. Not for her. For him, men's shoes, the kind you wore with a work outfit, dark brown with a simple design. The right size, which meant she had somehow found out his shoe size without asking him directly. And he thought about the various methods she might have used to accomplish this, and felt a complicated warmth. Not expensives. They were not expensive shoes. They were clearly the shoes of a child who had saved her allowance for some amount of time and spent it as carefully as she could. The leather was good quality for what they were. They would work. They were the most thought-through present he'd been given in recent memory. Thought, Emma said, and then stopped and started again. You got the new job and you wear nicer stuff now, and your shoes are kind of old. She said it, practically. No, the way she said most things, but her hands were folded on the table in the specific way of someone sitting very carefully with some elves. I got you new ones. Nathan looked at the shoes. He looked at his daughter. He thought about standing in the lobby of the building in his old shoes on a Tuesday morning, listening to his badge clip against the lanyard as he walked toward the door. He thought about the 40 minutes on the sidewalk and the math he'd done about swim lessons and groceries and groceries, and what it was going to cost to not have a paycheck. He thought about all the mornings and all the years of doing this alone, making the cheap coffee and finding the lost shoe and telling her true things about butterflies, and how none of it had felt insufficient exactly, but none of it had been easy either, and how the 8-year-old across the table from him had somehow, in her own 8-year-old way, saved up her money and gone to a store and thought about what he might need and tried to give it to him. He put the lid back on the box carefully. He looked at Emma. She was watching him with the expression that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite making it. He got up from his chair and went around the table and hugged her the way he had when she was smaller, the full kind of hug that she sometimes now considered herself too old for, but didn't resist tonight. She hugged him back hard, the way kids do, when they've been waiting for something to land. Thank you, he said, into the top of her head. They're the right size, she said, muffled against his shoulder. I checked twice. They're perfect, he said, and he meant it the way you mean things when they arrive unexpectedly and turn out to be exactly what you needed, not because the thing itself is grand, but because of what it contains. What it says about the person who gave it. What it says about what they saw when they looked at you. He held his daughter for a moment longer than the hug required. She let him, which was its own kind of gift. After dinner, after Emma was in bed, Nathan sat on the couch in the living room in the specific quiet of an apartment at 9 o'clock, when the day has finally finished, and the next one hasn't started yet. The shoebox was on the coffee table in front of him. He'd tried the shoes on, and they fit, as promised. They were on the floor, beside the couch now, next to his old ones. He thought about the version of himself standing outside the Meridian building 7 months ago. The empty lanyard, the cold air, the 7 vehicles pulling up to the curb. He thought about all the versions of that story that could have gone differently if Marsh had arrived. An hour later, if the broker had moved faster, if Reyes hadn't been as precise, or Gabe hadn't been paying attention, or Patricia hadn't picked up on the second. He thought about how many of the things that had worked out depended on circumstances that could have arranged themselves otherwise, and how little of the outcome had been within his control, and how the only thing that had been consistently within his control was the work itself, the careful, documented, quiet, unacknowledged work of doing what he thought was right, even when it seemed like no one was listening. Someone had been listening, not the people he'd sent the reports to. Someone. He thought about Gloria and accounts receivable and her $1,100 and the surgery that had happened because a fund existed that hadn't existed 7 months ago, and he thought about the other applications that had come in since May 6 of them, varying in scale and type, all of them resolved within the timeline the criteria required, all of them representing a person who had been one breakdown away from a version of the sidewalk calculation Nathan knew too well, and who now wasn't. Thought about Derek Holt, who was navigating the early stages of a federal prosecution with an attorney who was good, but not good enough to make the evidence disappear. He thought about Marcus Webb, whose cooperation hadn't saved him from charges, but had shaped the nature of them. He thought about Raymond Cass, whose jurisdictional argument had failed in September, as Reyes had predicted it would. Ultimately, he thought about Avery, who had come to his office 2 weeks ago with a problem about a security protocol gap she'd identified and wanted his read on, sat across from him and asked for his actual opinion rather than a version of it softened for executive comfort, and who had taken what he said and used it without modification, and who was slowly, imperfectly, the way that real change actually moved, becoming someone different from the person who had held out her hand for his badge on a Tuesday morning. People were not fixed. That was the thing he'd been sitting with since that morning in March, turning it over in different lights and finding it remained true no matter the angle. Derek Holt had been a person Nathan had trusted, and underneath that trust had been years of calculated betrayal. Avery Sinclair had been a person Nathan had considered remote and decisive and largely irrelevant to his daily life, and underneath that had been someone who could sit in a conference room at 6 in the evening with cafeteria-quality coffee and tell the truth about why she'd done something wrong. Webb had been a person Nathan had sent his concerns to in good faith, and Webb had taken that good faith and weaponized it, and was now a person sitting with the consequences of that choice. Of them were simple. None of them had been legible from the outside. Terrible thing and the hopeful thing were the same thing. You couldn't fully know a person from what they showed you. You could only know what they did when it cost them something. Nathan had kept submitting reports when it would have been easier to stop. Gabe had flagged errors in someone else's documentation when nobody asked him to. Patricia had answered on the second ring. Mrs. Okafor had given Emma crackers and kept her calm until her father could get there. Gerald Marsh had walked across the sidewalk and introduced himself to a man holding an empty lanyard clip and said, "We've been looking for you," which was one of the most significant sentences anyone had said to Nathan in his adult life, and which Marsh had delivered with the same matter-of-fact steadiness he brought to everything else. Of it was heroic. It was just people doing what they'd decided to do, in the small increments that make up a life, and some of those increments landing combinations that changed things. He reached over and turned off the lamp on the side table. The living room went to the soft dark of a city apartment. At night, not fully dark, never fully dark. The ambient light of the street coming through the curtains. The shoes on the floor, the shoebox on the table, the quiet from Emma's room down the hall. He'd walked out of that building in March, carrying less than he'd walked in with. No. He'd walked back in carrying something different. Not just the restored credentials and the new title, but the knowledge of what he'd held on to while he stood on the sidewalk, not knowing whether anything was going to come right. He'd held on to himself, his record, the truth of the work he'd done. He hadn't begged or bargained or collapsed, and he hadn't hardened either, hadn't let the injustice of the morning calcify into something that would have made him smaller and colder and less useful. Stood on the sidewalk and waited, and the truth had caught up. It did that sometimes. Not always, not reliably, not with the frequency that people deserved. But sometimes when someone had done the work carefully enough, and the records existed, and the right people were paying attention, and the timing held, it caught up. And when it did, it tended to catch everything. Holt and Webb and Cass and the archive that had been falsified, and the reports that had been buried, and the 40 minutes on a cold March sidewalk that had felt like the end of something. It had not been the end. It had been, in the specific way that awful things sometimes turned out to be, the moment the right direction finally became visible. Nathan sat in the dark for a little while longer, not sleeping but resting, which was different. Then he got up, checked the door, turned off the kitchen light Emma had left on, and went to bed. Tomorrow he had a 7:30 meeting with Harriet about the fund's quarterly review. He had a conversation scheduled with the new head of IT about network security architecture. He had a report to finish and a call to return and an 8-year-old to get to school by 7:45. The regular life, the one he'd built, imperfectly, over years of mornings that were too early and budgets that were too tight and nights when he lay awake doing the math. The life that had felt precarious for so long that he'd stopped noticing the precariousness and just started calling it Tuesday. Closed his eyes. Down the hall, his daughter was sleeping under the solar system poster in the careful dark of her room, already somewhere in a dream, completely unaware that the shoes she had wrapped badly with too much tape and the wrong amount of care on a random October evening had landed in her father exactly where she'd intended them to. She was 8 years old, and she already knew, in the wordless way that children know things they don't yet have language for, that the right gift at the right moment wasn't about the thing itself. It was about paying attention, about seeing someone clearly enough to know what they needed and deciding that they were worth the effort of trying to give it. He had learned that from somewhere. Nathan slept,